When Victor Hayes, a Black Air Marshal, boards Flight 217, he expects a routine journey. But before the plane even reaches cruising altitude, a single accusation changes everything. Mistaken for a threat, Victor is restrained by the very people he's sworn to protect. But as fear spreads through the cabin, the real danger reveals itself: a group of ruthless hijackers, and a hacker controlling the plane from the outside. With time running out and the aircraft locked on a collision course with Washington, D.C., Victor must fight to take back control. Outnumbered, unarmed, and betrayed, he faces the ultimate question. Can he save the passengers who saw him as the enemy? Subscribe for more thrilling stories. Where in the world are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. Victor adjusted his seatbelt, sighing as he settled into the plush seat of first class. It was supposed to be a quiet flight. No assignments, no threats, just a few hours of peace before returning to work. But peace was rarely an option for a man like him. Across the aisle, an older white businessman, Richard Malcolm, eyed him warily. His wife leaned closer, whispering something. Victor caught snippets. Looks out of place. Who flies first class dressed like that? Victor ignored them. He had faced worse. Instead, he focused on the flight attendants, scanning the cabin as part of his ingrained routine. A young woman in uniform approached Karen Wilkins. Her name tag read. She smiled, but her eyes held uncertainty. "Sir, may I see your ticket again?" Victor raised an eyebrow. "I already showed it at the gate." Karen hesitated before offering an apologetic smile. "Just standard procedure." Victor handed her his boarding pass. She examined it, then, satisfied, returned it. But as she walked away, he heard her whisper to another attendant, "He doesn't look like he belongs here." Victor clenched his jaw. He was used to this. Years in law enforcement had taught him patience. Still, something about this flight felt off. Then it happened. Richard suddenly tensed in his seat, staring at Victor's earphones, custom-issued Air Marshal communication devices. His face contorted with fear. "Oh my God," he gasped. "He's got a device." Panic spread like wildfire. "He's a terrorist," someone screamed. Before Victor could react, a burly man from economy ex-military, by the looks of him, lunged. "Wait," Victor began, but the man tackled him into the seat. A flurry of hands grabbed at him. A zip tie tightened around his wrists. Someone Karen, he realized, was shouting for the captain. Victor gritted his teeth. They weren't listening. They saw a black man with a device and assumed the worst. His badge was ignored. His credentials meant nothing. As the passengers settled, convinced they had averted a disaster, the cabin speaker crackled to life. A voice, sharp, menacing, filled the space. "No one move. This is a hijacking." The plane plunged into chaos. The cabin erupted into chaos. Passengers gasped, gripping their armrests, as the chilling announcement sank in. The sterile hum of the airplane now carried a heavy tension, thick enough to suffocate. Victor sat still, his wrists tightly bound with zip ties, his pulse steady despite the rising storm around him. He had spent years preparing for situations like this, but he had never expected to be on the wrong side of the fight. Karen, the flight attendant who had just accused him minutes ago, clutched the back of a seat, her face pale. Richard Malcolm, who had started the panic, gaped at the intercom as if willing it to be a mistake. "Ladies and gentlemen," the voice continued, smooth but firm, "you are now under our control. Stay in your seats, and no one gets hurt." Victor scanned the cabin. 3 men had risen from different seats, their movements synchronized. One near the cockpit, one in the aisle, and the last in the back. They were professionals. The tallest of the 3, a man with slicked-back blonde hair, removed his jacket, revealing a belt of fake explosives wrapped around his waist. "Now that we have your attention," he said with a smirk, "let's make this easy." Passengers whimpered. Someone sobbed softly. Victor exhaled through his nose, calculating. His hands were still bound, his movements limited. He needed to be smart. The hijacker at the front turned to Karen. "Get the captain on the intercom. Tell him to open the cockpit." Karen hesitated. Her eyes darted to Victor, a silent plea for help. "Now you want my help?" Victor thought bitterly. She turned back to the hijacker and stammered, "I can't." Blondie tilted his head. "Maybe I need motivation." He stepped toward an older woman in the front row. "How about you, ma'am? Want to volunteer to make an example of what happens when people don't cooperate?" The woman shrank back, pressing into her seat. Victor clenched his fists. If he didn't act now, this would escalate fast. He shifted slightly, testing the strength of the zip ties. Too tight. His best option was to get close enough to disarm one of the hijackers. But he was restrained, and they had weapons. He had to get creative. A passenger a few rows back, a young man in glasses, muttered under his breath, "Oh God, we're all gonna die." Blondie spun. On him. What was that? Victor seized the moment. He slumped forward, letting out a pained groan. Karen flinched. What's wrong with him?" Blondie barely spared him a glance. "He's tied up. He's fine." Victor groaned louder. He bent his head, making sure his breathing sounded labored. "Too tight. I can't." Karen blinked. Realization dawned. He looks bad," she said, voice shaky but loud enough for the hijackers to hear. "He was struggling before we tied him. Maybe he's having a heart attack." Victor made his body tremble, his breath ragged. He let his head drop forward like he was on the verge of collapsing. Blondie sighed. "Seriously? Now." He waved to one of his men, a bearded guy with a scar on his cheek. "Check him." Scarface hesitated. "What if it's a trick?" Blondie rolled his eyes. "Then shoot him if he moves." Scarface approached, crouching beside Victor. Victor's pulse quickened. This was his chance. Scarface grabbed Victor's arm, feeling for a pulse. Victor went limp. Then, in a flash, he twisted his wrists, using Scarface's own grip to yank him forward. The hijacker's face smashed into Victor's shoulder. Victor swung both legs up, locking them around Scarface's neck. The cabin gasped. Victor yanked hard, flipping Scarface onto the floor. The impact stunned him. Victor wriggled his hands, snapping the zip ties. Blondie's eyes widened. What the Victor was already moving. He grabbed Scarface's gun. Passengers screamed. Blondie lunged for his own weapon. Bang. Victor fired a single warning shot into the ceiling. The entire plane fell into silence. The deafening gunshot echoed through the cabin. Passengers flinched, some ducking instinctively. The smell of burnt gunpowder lingered in the air. Victor Hayes stood, now free, holding Scarface's gun in a steady grip. His heartbeat pounded in his ears, but his expression remained calm. He had just flipped the situation. For a split second, no one moved. The hijackers, who moments ago had full control, now faced an unexpected problem, an armed air marshal they had underestimated. Blondie recovered first. He took a careful step forward, hands slightly raised, his cocky smirk returning. "All right, big guy. You got one shot off. But let's be real, you're outnumbered." Victor's eyes flicked between the remaining two hijackers. The third man, positioned near the rear of the plane, reached for something under his jacket. A secondary weapon. Victor fired again, not at him, but at the overhead luggage bin just inches from his head. The metal dented with an explosive clang. The hijacker froze mid-motion. "I can do this all day," Victor said evenly, his voice carrying a quiet authority. "Who wants to be next?" Passengers held their breath. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Karen, still crouched near the front, stared at Victor with wide eyes. Just minutes ago, she had been one of the people who doubted him, restrained him. And now, he was the only reason they weren't at the mercy of the hijackers. Blondie's smirk faltered for the first time. He glanced between his men, calculating. "You don't want to start something you can't finish, Marshal." Victor's jaw tightened. They knew who he was now. "I don't start fights," he said coolly. "I finish them." Blondie chuckled, shaking his head. "We got explosives, hero. You can take us down, but you take yourself and everyone else with us." Victor's grip tightened on the gun. He needed more information. Were the bombs real or fake? Was there someone else pulling the strings? And most importantly, what was their goal? He glanced at Karen. "The cockpit," he said quickly. "Did they make contact?" Karen hesitated, then nodded. "They told me to get the captain on the intercom." Victor's stomach dropped. If the hijackers got into the cockpit, this situation would go from bad to catastrophic. He refocused on Blondie. "The captain isn't opening that door for you," Victor said. "So what's the real plan?" Blondie raised an eyebrow. "You assume we're amateurs." Victor narrowed his eyes. Something was off. Hijackings weren't random acts of chaos. They had a purpose. Blondie tilted his head. "Tell me, Marshal, have you ever heard of a remote breach?" Victor didn't like where this was going. Blondie chuckled. "While we've been chatting, someone else has been working on taking over this plane from the ground. Who needs a pilot when you have a hacker?" A chill ran down Victor's spine. This wasn't just a hijacking. This was something worse. The plane lurched suddenly. Passengers screamed. The overhead lights flickered. Karen gasped, pressing a hand to her mouth. "Oh my God, they're not lying." Victor's mind raced. If someone on the ground was remotely interfering with the aircraft systems, then even if he stopped the hijackers, they could still crash the plane. Blondie grinned. "You were so focused on stopping us, you didn't even realize. You've already lost." Victor's jaw clenched. "Not yet." He turned to Karen. "We need someone who understands the plane systems." "Who's on board?" Karen's eyes darted across the cabin. "There's a passenger, Ethan Reynolds. He's a software engineer." Victor nodded sharply. That was his next move. Blondie smirked. "You're wasting your time. This plane belongs to us now." Victor raised the gun, leveling it at Blondie's head. "Not if I have anything to say about it." The plane shuddered again, dipping slightly before stabilizing. Gasps filled the cabin. Some passengers gripped their seats with white-knuckled terror, while others clutched loved ones, as though the act alone would keep them safe. Victor didn't flinch. He kept his gun trained on Blondie, but his mind was already several steps ahead. If the hijackers had someone hacking the flight system remotely, they weren't just here to make demands. This was about control. Blondie, still wearing his arrogant smirk, tilted his head slightly. "You feel that, Marshal? That's our guy, working his magic. We're not just hijacking a plane. We're rewriting the rules." Victor clenched his jaw. They weren't looking for ransom. They were making a statement. A sudden voice from behind broke his focus. "Hey, I can help." Victor spun, gun still steady. A young man in his late 20s, Ethan Reynolds, slowly raised his hands. He had shaggy brown hair, thick glasses, and an anxious expression. Karen pointed at him. "That's Ethan. He's a software engineer." Victor's sharp gaze locked onto him. "You know how they're doing this?" Ethan gulped. "And maybe. If they hacked into the avionics system, they're remotely accessing the flight controls. If we don't cut them off, they could override everything." Victor nodded. "Then we stop them." Blondie laughed. "Oh, that's adorable. You think this nerd is going to out-hack our guy? He's been in the system for 10 minutes. By now, the plane jerked violently to the left. Screams erupted. Luggage tumbled from overhead bins. A flight attendant crashed into a row of seats. Victor caught himself, steadying his stance. He didn't have time for games. He turned to Karen. "We need access to the avionics bay." Karen's eyes widened. That's below the cockpit, but the door's locked. Only the flight crew has access." Blondie grinned. "And they're a little busy, aren't they?" Victor's mind worked at lightning speed. He needed a way to get in. The pilots were likely holding position, trying to regain control. But if they failed, another jolt shook the plane. Ethan yelped, gripping the nearest seat. "They're forcing the aircraft into a slow bank. If they tip it too far, we won't recover." Victor cursed under his breath. He grabbed Ethan by the shoulder. "If I get you access, can you stop it?" Ethan hesitated, then nodded quickly. Blondie let out a whistle. "Oh, this is fun to watch. But here's the thing," suddenly, he lunged. Victor reacted instantly. Blondie went for Victor's wrist, trying to knock the gun away. But Victor was faster. He sidestepped, twisted his arm, and used Blondie's own momentum to slam him into a seat. Passengers screamed as the hijacker grunted in pain. Victor pressed the gun to the back of his head. "Move again," he said coldly, "and I end this." Blondie froze. Victor turned to Karen. "The avionics bay. Open it. Karen, still shaken, hurried toward the front. Blondie chuckled, muffled against the seat. Even if you get in, you won't have time. Victor ignored him. He followed Karen, dragging Blondie with him as a human shield. Ethan scurried close behind. They had minutes, maybe less. And if they failed, the plane wouldn't just crash. It would be hijacked by an invisible enemy, one they couldn't even see. Victor moved swiftly through the narrow aisle, keeping a tight grip on Blondie's collar. The hijacker grunted in protest, but Victor barely paid him any attention. His mind was focused on one goal, getting to the avionics bay before it was too late. Karen led the way, her hands trembling as she fumbled with her keycard. "The avionics bay is locked," she muttered. "Only the pilots or senior crew members have access." Victor's grip tightened around his stolen weapon. "Then we don't ask nicely." Blondie let out a weak chuckle. "You really think you're the hero here? You don't even know what you're stopping." Victor ignored him. Karen swiped the keycard across the small security panel beside a discreet door near the cockpit. The light blinked red. "Damn it," she whispered. "The system's been overridden. I can't get in." Victor exhaled sharply. The hijackers were one step ahead. "Move," he ordered. Karen stepped aside, and without hesitation, Victor raised the gun and fired. The gunshot was deafening in the tight space. Sparks flew as the lock shattered, and the door swung open violently. Ethan gasped. "Whoa, okay, that works." Blondie laughed through the pain. "Oh, you're full of surprises, aren't you, Marshal?" Victor shoved him against the wall. "Stay put." Blondie wiped a trickle of blood from his lip, grinning despite everything. He wasn't scared, and that worried Victor. Ignoring him, Victor gestured to Ethan. "Go. Do what you need to." The young engineer hesitated for only a moment before diving into the avionics bay. The room was small, crammed with panels of blinking lights, cables, and complex systems Victor barely understood. It was the brain of the aircraft. Ethan dropped to his knees and yanked open a panel. His fingers flew across the exposed wires. "They're routing the plane's controls remotely," he muttered. "I can see the access points, but..." The plane lurched hard to the left. Karen cried out, grabbing a seat for balance. Victor braced himself. Passengers screamed as overhead bins rattled violently. Ethan's eyes widened in horror. "They're trying to force a descent." Victor turned to Karen. "Tell the pilots to keep the nose up, buy us time." Karen nodded and ran toward the cockpit. Victor turned back to Ethan. "Can you stop it?" Ethan's hands moved frantically. "I'm trying. But this isn't just a basic breach. Whoever's doing this is damn good." His voice trembled. "If I shut it down wrong, I could kill us all." Victor clenched his jaw. No mistakes. No second chances. Then Blondie lunged. Victor saw him a second too late. The hijacker slammed into him, knocking the gun from his grip. It skidded across the floor. Blondie swung a wild punch, catching Victor in the ribs. Pain exploded through his side. But he gritted his teeth and countered. He drove an elbow into Blondie's gut, making him double over. Then, with a swift movement, Victor grabbed him by the collar and threw him against the avionics wall. Blondie coughed, his smirk finally fading. "You don't get it," he panted. "Even if you stop us, the real threat isn't here." Victor's eyes narrowed. That's what he was afraid of. Ethan suddenly shouted, "Got it." The plane stabilized slightly. Victor snapped back to him. "You stopped them." Ethan shook his head. "Not completely. But I blocked them from forcing a dive." He looked up, panicked. "They're still in the system. They can still mess with us." Blondie chuckled weakly. "And they will." Victor exhaled sharply. This wasn't over. He grabbed Blondie by the shirt. "Then we find out what's coming next before it's too late." The cabin was eerily quiet after the violent struggle. The passengers, still gripping their seats, had stopped screaming, but the fear in their eyes remained. The plane had stabilized for now, but Victor knew the battle was far from over. Blondie, still pinned against the avionics panel, smirked despite his bloody lip. "You really think you've won something, don't you?" he muttered. Victor tightened his grip on the hijacker's shirt. "You're out of time. Your plan failed. Now tell me who's pulling the strings." Blondie let out a weak chuckle. You still don't get it. The person controlling this plane isn't here. Victor already knew that much. The hacker wasn't on board. But Blondie's arrogance told him something worse. They weren't done. Ethan, still crouched beside the open avionics panel, looked up, his face pale. He's right, he said breathlessly. Whoever's doing this, they're not just trying to crash the plane. He pointed at the screen in front of him, his fingers trembling. They're rerouting our flight path. Victor's stomach dropped. Where? Ethan hesitated, typing frantically. I don't know yet, but they've locked the pilots out. If I don't break the encryption, we're just going wherever they want us to. Karen, who had returned from the cockpit, paled. The captain said they still don't have control. Ethan nodded. They're trying, but this is beyond a basic system breach. Whoever did this plan for contingencies. Blondie grinned. Like I said, Marshal, you've already lost. Victor resisted the urge to knock the smile off his face. Instead, he pressed him harder against the wall. Who are you working for? Blondie's eyes darkened. You'll find out soon enough. Before Victor could push further, the plane jolted again. Not a violent lurch, this time more of a deliberate movement. Ethan's eyes widened. They're making us descend again. Victor turned to Karen. Tell the pilots to hold altitude as long as they can. She nodded and ran toward the cockpit. Victor faced Ethan. Can you override it? Ethan hesitated. I think so, but it'll take time. Victor didn't have time. Blondie chuckled under his breath. Time's up, Marshal. Victor had enough. He yanked Blondie forward and slammed him into the opposite wall. Start talking, he growled, or I swear you won't be conscious when we land. Blondie finally winced. He tried to hide it behind another smirk, but Victor saw the flicker of doubt in his eyes. You're already too late, Blondie said, but this time, his voice lacked its usual arrogance. This isn't just about taking over a plane. This is about making a statement. Victor's grip on his shirt tightened. What statement? Blondie exhaled shakily. That no one is safe. Not in the air. Not on the ground. Nowhere. Victor's blood ran cold. This wasn't just a hijacking. This was an act of terror. Ethan cursed under his breath. They're redirecting us toward a major city. He turned, horrified. They're planning to crash us on purpose. Karen reappeared, her face stricken. The captain says our flight path is leading us straight toward Washington, D.C. The weight of the revelation hit all at once. If Victor didn't stop this in time, they wouldn't just be losing one plane. They'd be walking straight into a massive attack. Blondie let out a weak chuckle. Now you get it. Victor gritted his teeth. Not on my watch. The tension inside the plane was suffocating. Every second that passed brought them closer to disaster. Washington, D.C. the target. The realization settled over Victor like a crushing weight. This wasn't just about a hijacking anymore. This was an attack on U.S. soil. Blondie was breathing heavily now, the impact of Victor's last shove still rattling through his body. But his smirk remained. There's no stopping it now, he muttered. You might as well sit back and enjoy the ride. Victor ignored him and turned to Ethan. Can you block the hacker? Ethan wiped sweat from his forehead, fingers flying across the keyboard of the exposed avionics panel. I'm trying. I cut their first connection, but they're using a secondary relay. Every time I block one pathway, they open another. Victor exhaled sharply. The hacker was too good. This wasn't some amateur in a basement. Whoever was doing this was highly trained and had planned for every possible countermeasure. Karen swallowed hard. The pilots are trying manual override again, but she hesitated. They say if we drop below 10,000 feet, they'll lose all ability to regain control. Victor's gut clenched. If they didn't stop this before then, it was over. Blondie chuckled. That's about 15 minutes from now. Just in case you're keeping track. Victor had no patience for his arrogance. He slammed him back against the wall. I need a name. Who's behind this? Blondie's smirk faltered for the first time. He hesitated just a second too long. He was scared. Victor narrowed his eyes. Who are you more afraid of, me or the people pulling your strings? Blondie swallowed, but before he could speak, the cabin lights flickered. Ethan's screen went black. "Oh no," Ethan whispered, horror creeping into his voice. His fingers scrambled at the keyboard. They just locked me out completely." Victor's heart pounded. "What does that mean?" Ethan turned, face pale. "It means we just lost our last chance to stop them from here." A chill ran through Victor's body. They had been one step behind the entire time. Blondie let out a slow, amused exhale. "And now you lose." Karen gasped as her radio crackled to life. A voice, one that wasn't the pilot, spoke calmly. "Flight 217, you are now in final approach sequence. Stand by for impact." Victor grabbed the radio from Karen's hands. "Who is this?" Silence. "Then you already know." The voice was distorted, but Victor recognized the cold confidence behind it. This wasn't just an anonymous hacker. This was the mastermind. Blondie let out a quiet laugh. "Told you." Victor's grip on the radio tightened. He refused to accept this. He wasn't about to let everyone on this plane, hundreds of innocent people, die because he had been outmaneuvered. Ethan was still frantically typing, desperate to find a way back in. "If we can't break the hack remotely, we need to cut the signal manually." Victor snapped his head toward him. "How?" Ethan hesitated. "The satellite receiver. It's how they're controlling us. If we disable it, they lose access." Victor didn't hesitate. "Where?" Karen's face drained of color. "It's on top of the plane." Victor exhaled slowly. Of course it was. Because nothing about this mission could be simple. Ethan looked at him, already knowing the answer to the question he was about to ask. "You're going up there, aren't you?" Victor locked eyes with him. "Unless you've got a better idea." Ethan swallowed hard. "You do realize how insane that is, right?" Victor turned to Karen. "There's a maintenance hatch, isn't there?" Karen nodded slowly. "Yes. But the wind shears up there, Victor. It could kill you." He glanced at the passengers. The fear in their eyes. The way they clung to their loved ones. They were counting on him. Victor turned back to Karen. "Then I better not fail." Blondie, still slumped against the wall, grinned. "I hope you do, Marshal. I'd love to see the look on your face when you realize it was all for nothing." Victor ignored him. He turned to Ethan. "Tell the pilots to hold altitude as long as possible." Then he moved toward the hatch. There was no turning back now. The moment Victor pushed open the maintenance hatch, the wind slammed into him like a freight train. The deafening roar of the engines filled his ears, and the force of the high-altitude wind nearly yanked him off the ladder. He clenched his teeth, tightening his grip as he climbed onto the narrow exterior walkway near the fuselage. Below him, the vast darkness of the Atlantic Ocean stretched endlessly. Above, the sky was an endless void, broken only by the occasional flash of distant lightning. One wrong move, one misstep, and he would be gone, swept away into nothing. But Victor didn't have time to think about that. The plane was still locked into its deadly course, heading straight for Washington, D.C. If he didn't disable the satellite receiver in time, the hijacker's plan would succeed. As he pulled himself fully onto the aircraft surface, his body fought against the brutal force of the wind. Every step was a battle, his boots struggling to find traction on the metal plating. Through the cockpit window, Victor caught a glimpse of the pilots. One of them, Captain Reeves, made eye contact, his face tight with fear. But when he saw Victor, his expression shifted to something else. Hope. Victor turned his gaze toward his target, the satellite receiver, a small, dome-like structure positioned just ahead of the tail section. It was the plane's only connection to the outside hacker. If he could sever it, they might regain control. But someone else had the same idea. As Victor inched forward, movement caught his eye. A figure in black was already up here. One of the hijackers. His pulse quickened. They had been prepared for this. The hijacker was strapped to the aircraft with a safety harness, making him immune to the deadly wind forces. And he had a knife. Victor had neither. The man turned, his face hidden beneath a tactical mask. He pointed at Victor, then slashed at the wires connecting the receiver to the plane. Victor's stomach dropped. He wasn't just protecting the hacker's connection, he was ensuring that if anyone tried to stop them, the plane would be left without navigation entirely. Victor lunged forward. The fight was on. The hijacker struck first, slashing the air between them, trying to keep Victor back. But Victor was faster. He ducked low, sweeping his leg out. The hijacker stumbled, but caught himself, using his harness for balance. He lashed out with the knife again this time, grazing Victor's arm. Pain burned, but Victor didn't stop. He seized the man's wrist, twisting it violently. The knife clattered away, sliding down the fuselage. The hijacker snarled, but Victor didn't give him time to recover. He drove his elbow into the man's ribs. The hijacker gasped, doubling over. That was all Victor needed. With one final heave, he yanked the man's harness loose. For a split second, the hijacker's eyes widened in horror. Then the wind took him. He was gone. Victor didn't watch him fall. There was no time. Blood trickled down his arm, but he ignored it. He reached the receiver, gripping it tightly as the plane shuddered beneath him. From inside the cockpit, Karen's voice crackled through the radio. "Victor, we're dropping below 15,000 feet. If you don't cut that signal now." Victor didn't let her finish. He ripped out the primary cable. The effect was instant. The plane lurched violently, as if an invisible force had suddenly released its grip. Inside, Ethan screamed, "They're locked out. We're taking control back." Victor exhaled sharply. He had done it. But then the plane dipped. Again. Something was still wrong. Victor turned, his heart pounding. The receiver was still active. And then he realized there was a backup system. The job wasn't finished yet. And he was running out of time. Victor's breath came fast and hard, the icy wind tearing at his skin as he stared at the receiver in disbelief. He had ripped out the primary cable. The hijackers should have lost control. But the plane was still dipping. Then he saw it a secondary power source. The hijackers had anticipated this. They had a backup system in place. Victor's stomach clenched. If he didn't take it out right now, nothing he had done would matter. The plane would still be heading for Washington, D.C. and disaster. His fingers, numb from the wind, gripped the metal panel covering the backup system. It was bolted shut. He had no tools. He needed something, anything, to break it open. His mind raced, scanning the surface of the plane. That's when he spotted the hijacker's knife. It had slid just a few feet away. Balancing his body against the wind, Victor lunged forward. His fingers barely brushed against the handle when the plane tilted sharply. The knife slid further down. Victor's heart slammed in his chest. If he lost that blade, he had no way of cutting the final connection. No time to think. He threw himself forward, sliding on the fuselage, grabbing the knife just as it reached the edge. For a moment, he dangled dangerously close to the abyss. Nothing but empty sky beneath him. Adrenaline surged through his veins. He forced his body backward, crawling back to the receiver. Inside the cockpit, Karen's voice crackled through his earpiece. "Victor, the pilots say we've dropped below 12,000 feet. They're fighting for control, but we're running out of time." Victor ignored the pain in his arm, the burn in his muscles. He jammed the knife into the panel's seam and pried it open. Beneath the metal, a second set of wires pulsed faintly with power. This was it. The last connection keeping the hijackers in control. Ethan's voice cut in. "Victor, whatever you're going to do, do it now." Victor didn't hesitate. He sliced through the wires. The reaction was instantaneous. The plane shuddered violently, then stabilized. For a brief, terrifying moment, everything went silent. Victor held his breath. Then Karen's voice exploded over the radio. "We have control. Repeat, the pilots have full control." Victor exhaled, his entire body sagging with relief. Inside the cockpit, alarms stopped blaring. The pilots, drenched in sweat, manually adjusted the altitude. The aircraft leveled. Out. In the cabin, passengers gasped, then erupted into cheers. Karen's voice came back on the line. "Victor, you did it." Victor let out a shaky breath, his body trembling not from fear, but from the sheer exhaustion of the fight. Then he heard something he didn't expect. Laughter. Not from the passengers. From Blondie. Victor froze. The radio crackled with static. Then came the voice, the same distorted, icy voice of the hacker. You really think it's over? Victor's blood ran cold. What were they planning next? The hacker's voice crackled through the radio, low and mocking. You really think it's over? Victor's grip tightened around the knife, still in his hand. His body ached. His muscles burned from the brutal fight against the wind and gravity. But he wasn't done yet. Not until this plane was safely on the ground. Inside the cockpit, Karen's voice came back, urgent and breathless. Victor, the pilots have control, but something's wrong. The autopilot won't disengage, and we're still descending. The system is fighting them. Victor's stomach dropped. The hacker had a failsafe. Even though Victor had severed the satellite connection, there was still something inside the plane keeping their control active. Blondie's voice, full of amusement, cut in. Oh, Marshal, you put on a great show up there. But our guy? He's always 10 steps ahead. Victor's mind raced. What was left? He had cut the remote access. The pilots had regained partial control. But the plane was still descending. Why? Then it clicked. The hijackers had someone else on board. A second operative. Someone still inside the avionics system, manually keeping the plane locked into its final approach. Victor spun toward the maintenance hatch. Karen, is anyone missing? From the main cabin. Static crackled before her response came. Yes, 2 of the hijackers. One got thrown off the plane, but the other ran toward the cargo hold when things went south. Victor's jaw clenched. That was it. He shoved the knife into his belt and swung his legs back down the maintenance hatch. The moment his boots hit the floor, he broke into a full sprint. The fight wasn't over. The cargo hold was dimly lit, filled with the constant hum of the engines and the rattling of luggage. Victor moved carefully, gun raised, heart pounding. The last hijacker was here somewhere. A noise of faint beeping. Victor's breath hitched. He followed the sound, moving past crates and secured luggage. Then he saw it. A man crouched by an open electrical panel, frantically typing on a small device. A blinking LED screen showed numbers, data streams. He wasn't just keeping the autopilot locked. He was priming the plane for a crash override. Victor didn't hesitate. Step away. Now. The man stiffened, but didn't turn around. You're too late. Victor took a step forward, gun aimed. I said step away. The hijacker turned and smirked. Then he pressed a final key. Victor fired. The bullet struck the hijacker in the shoulder, sending him sprawling. But it was too late. The beeping on the device changed, accelerated. Karen's voice burst over the radio. Victor, we're losing altitude again. The plane's locked into a rapid descent. Victor ran to the device, scanning the screen. A fail-safe program. If it fully executed, the plane would nosedive, a guaranteed crash. He had 60 seconds. Victor had no idea how to hack, no idea how to undo the program. He was out of time. So he did the only thing he could. He shot the device. A single round tore through the motherboard. Sparks exploded from the console. The beeping turned to static, then died. Silence. Then the plane steadied. Karen's voice came back, filled with shock. Victor, the pilots have full control. We're leveling out. Victor exhaled, shoulders sagging. It was over. Flight 217 touched down at a secure military airstrip outside Washington, D.C. The moment the wheels hit the ground, passengers burst into cheers, sobs of relief filling the cabin. Victor, still in the cargo hold, leaned back against a crate, letting the tension drain from his body. They had done it. As the plane came to a stop, he stood, exhaling slowly. Now it was time for answers. Blondie and the surviving hijackers were dragged off in cuffs. The last one, the hacker Victor shot, was barely conscious as he was hauled out by authorities. Karen approached him, her eyes still filled with shock. You saved all of us. Victor shook his head. Not just me. He looked over at Ethan, who was still gripping his laptop, shaking. We all did. Then Richard Malcolm, the same man who had called Victor a terrorist, stepped forward, guilt plain on his face. Victor met his eyes. Richard swallowed. I misjudged you. Victor let the silence stretch before finally replying. Yeah, you did. No anger. No bitterness. Just a simple truth. Richard looked away, ashamed. The FBI swarmed the tarmac. Agents began questioning the passengers, securing the plane. A senior agent approached Victor. "Marshal Hayes, we'll need your full debrief." Victor nodded, but then he glanced at the plane one last time. He had spent years protecting flights from threats. But this time, he had been the threat in their eyes. Until he saved them. The irony wasn't lost on him. As he walked toward the briefing room, he allowed himself a single thought. Maybe next time, they'll think twice before making assumptions. As Victor walked away from the plane, the weight of the night settled on his shoulders. He had saved hundreds of lives, but not before being treated like the enemy. This wasn't just a story about a hijacking. It was about assumptions, fear, and how quickly people judge others based on appearances. But in the end, action spoke louder than prejudice. And Victor's actions had saved them all. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe for more thrilling narratives. Where in the world are you watching from? Let us know in the comments.